At -71 degrees Celsius, the air doesn't just bite, it shatters your lungs. Agnes knew this cold intimately, but she didn't know the massive, glowing eyes staring through her frosted window pane. Outside, a dying Siberian tiger cub lay paralyzed in the snow, while its mother watched in dead silence. The Chursky Range in the Sakha Republic of Siberia is not a place for the faint of heart, nor is it a place for the living when the deep winter sets in. Here, near the Oymyakon Valley, widely recognized as the pole of cold temperatures, routinely plunge to levels that turn boiling water into ice dust before it hits the ground. It was in this unforgiving white abyss that 72-year-old Agnes Whitmore had made her home. Agnes was not a typical recluse. A retired British wildlife biologist, she had spent 40 years studying apex predators in sub-zero environments alongside her late husband, David. When David passed away from a sudden heart attack a decade ago, Agnes didn't return to the damp, gray winters of London. Instead, she retreated to their remote research station, a reinforced, Soviet-era logging cabin, retrofitted with thick ironwood walls, triple-paned glass, and a cast-iron masonry heater that was the singular beating heart of her existence. It was the night of January 14th, when the mercury plummeted to a devastating 71 degrees Celsius. The cold was so absolute that the timber of the cabin groaned and cracked like rifle fire under the atmospheric pressure. Agnes was huddled in a thick wool blanket, nursing a mug of black tea, listening to the static hiss of her shortwave radio. She was waiting for her weekly check-in with Dr. Arthur Pendleton, a colleague stationed at a weather observatory 400 miles to the south in Yakutsk. "Agnes, do you copy? The pressure systems are collapsing. It's dropping faster than our models predicted." Arthur's voice crackled through the heavy static. Agnes keyed the microphone. "I hear you, Arthur. The thermometer outside my window just hit -71. Even the wolves have stopped howling. It's a dead zone out here. Stay inside, Agnes. Don't let the fire die. If you lose heat, you have less than 20 minutes before hypothermia takes your motor functions." "I know the drill, Arthur. Over and out," she replied, switching the radio to standby. She stood up to toss another heavy birch log into the stove. As the heavy iron door clanged shut, a sound pierced through the heavy silence of the cabin. It was faint, a scraping noise against the thick timber of the front porch, followed by a weak, rattling exhalation. Agnes froze. In this temperature, no animal should be moving. The local timber wolves would be burrowed deep under the snowpack, and the brown bears had been hibernating for months. She grabbed her heavy maglite and walked slowly to the reinforced window near the door, scraping the layer of frost away with her thumbnail. She peered into the blinding white darkness, illuminated only by the harsh, bluish glare of the security floodlight. At first, she saw nothing but the swirling vortex of snow. But then, a shape materialized on the wooden planks of her porch. It was a lump of snow, rising and falling with agonizing slowness. Agnes squinted. It wasn't a wolf. The coat, visible beneath the rime ice, was orange and black. Her breath hitched. An Amur tiger. It was scientifically impossible. Siberian tigers, while adapted to the cold, inhabited the Primorsky Krai and the Sikhote-Alin Mountains nearly 1,000 miles to the southeast. They did not belong in the deep Arctic tundra, and they certainly could not survive 71 degrees Celsius. Agnes didn't think. Her decades of training took over. The creature on her porch was a cub, roughly 4 months old, weighing perhaps 40 pounds. It was in the final, lethal stages of deep hypothermia. Its limbs were stiff, frozen to the wooden floorboards. Knowing the risks, knowing she could freeze her lungs just by breathing too deeply, Agnes threw on her heavy Arctic parka, 2 layers of thermal gloves, and a face mask. She grabbed a heavy crowbar and unlatched the heavy oak door. The cold hit her like a physical blow, a solid wall of kinetic energy that stole the breath from her chest. Her eyelashes froze together in seconds. She stepped onto the porch, the wind screaming in her ears. She knelt beside the cub. It was a male. His eyes were closed, his breathing reduced to a shallow rasp once every 10 seconds. The moisture on his fur had turned into an icy armor, welding his flank to the wood. Agnes wedged the crowbar beneath the ice, gently but firmly cracking the bond. The cub didn't even flinch. He was entirely unresponsive. Grunting with exertion, the elderly woman scooped the heavy, frozen animal into her arms. He felt like a block of marble. She kicked the door open, stumbled backward into the cabin, and slammed the door shut, locking out the deadly cold. She immediately placed the cub onto a thick rug near the cast-iron stove, but not too close. Thawing frozen tissue too quickly would cause fatal shock. Agnes worked frantically. She stripped off her own frozen outer layers and grabbed several dry wool blankets. She began to vigorously rub the cub's chest and extremities, trying to stimulate blood flow. She heated a bowl of water, dissolving a high-calorie emergency nutrient paste she kept for herself, and used a large plastic syringe to drip the warm liquid onto the cub's tongue. For 2 agonizing hours, there was no change. Agnes sat on the floor, her back aching, her hands cramping from the continuous massage. "Come on, little one," she whispered, her voice rough. At 2:14 a.m., the cub twitched. A low, gravelly sound, a mix between a cough and a purr, vibrated in his chest. His eyes fluttered open, revealing milky blue irises cloudy with exhaustion. He tried to lift his massive paws but failed, his head slumping back onto the rug. Agnes let out a long breath, wiping the sweat from her forehead. She had done it. She had pulled him back from the brink, but her relief was shattered seconds later. A shadow fell over the room. The moonlight streaming through the frosted window was suddenly eclipsed by something massive. Agnes turned her head, her blood running colder than the air outside. Standing on her porch, her face pressed against the thick, triple-paned glass, was the mother. She was a ghost of the taiga, a magnificent, terrifying force of nature. Even through the distorted, ice-caked glass, Agnes could see the sheer size of the adult Amur tigress. She easily weighed over 300 pounds, her massive shoulders rising above the window ledge. But she was not in prime condition. Her coat was matted with ice and dirt, her flanks were sunken, and a ragged, bloody scar ran down the side of her left eye. The tigress stared directly at Agnes. She didn't roar. She didn't bare her teeth or strike the glass. In the brutally unforgiving cold of 71 degrees Celsius, every calorie was a matter of life and death. A roar was a waste of energy. She simply stood there, a silent sentinel, her golden eyes burning with an intense, desperate intelligence. Agnes sat completely still on the floor, her hand resting protectively over the breathing cub. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The cabin was sturdy, but an adult tiger driven by maternal instinct and starvation was a force that could tear through a wooden door if she truly committed to it. Why is she just watching? Agnes thought, her scientific mind racing to override her primal fear. The answer came as Agnes watched the tigress shiver. The massive predator swayed slightly, her hind legs trembling. She was dying. The mother had likely carried or herded the cub for hundreds of miles, giving up whatever meager prey she found to keep him alive. She had tracked him to the cabin, watched Agnes take him inside, and now she was waiting. She didn't have the strength to fight, only the strength to stand guard until her heart gave out. Agnes slowly reached for the shortwave radio on the low table beside her. She kept her eyes locked on the window, moving with deliberate slowness so as not to startle the mother. "Arthur," Agnes whispered into the microphone, keeping the volume low. "Arthur, emergency." A minute passed before the static broke. "Agnes? It's 3 in the morning. Is the stove out?" "The stove is fine. Listen to me carefully," Agnes said, her eyes never leaving the golden gaze at the window. "I have a Siberian tiger cub in my cabin, and his mother is standing on my porch." Silence hung on the line, heavy and thick, broken only by the hiss of the radio. "Agnes, are you experiencing hypoxia? Check your carbon monoxide detector." Arthur's voice was laced with genuine panic. "Tigers are not in the Chersky range. It's impossible. I'm looking right at her. Arthur, she's starving, frostbitten, and she knows I have her cub. Why are they up here?" Agnes heard the rustling of papers on Arthur's end. "Wait. Agnes, 2 weeks ago, A remote sensing satellite picked up anomalous thermal blooms in the Khabarovsk region, a massive illegal logging operation, allegedly run by a syndicate led by a man named Viktor Romanov. They used explosives to clear a valley deep in the reserve. The shockwaves drove the wildlife out. If a mother lost her territory and was pursued by poachers, she might have just kept walking north to escape the noise, but to make it to Oymyakon, it's a death march. Agnes looked back at the mother. The tigress had finally succumbed to exhaustion. She had collapsed onto the porch, her massive back pressed flush against the bottom of the front door. She was using the microscopic draft of heat leaking from the cabin's interior to stave off the freezing air. "She's dying, Arthur," Agnes said softly. "If she dies, this cub cannot be released. He'll never learn how to hunt. He'll end up in a concrete cage in a zoo." "Agnes, do not intervene further," Arthur ordered, his voice stern. "You saved the cub, that's a miracle, but you cannot go out there. An adult, starving tiger is unpredictable. If you open that door to feed her, she will see you as prey. The blizzard is intensifying. The military base at Tixi cannot scramble a chopper in this weather. You are entirely on your own." "I know," Agnes said, and clicked the radio off. She looked at the cub. He was breathing steadily now, his body heat returning. She looked at the door. Through the bottom crack, she could hear the raspy, labored breathing of the mother. Agnes went to her pantry. She had a limited supply of food meant to last her until the spring thaw in May. She pulled out a heavy, frozen haunch of venison, easily 30 pounds of dense meat and fat that she kept in a sealed cold box. Her cabin had a small, reinforced refuse hatch near the back door, designed for throwing out ash and food scraps without having to step outside into a storm. It was barely wide enough for the venison. Agnes hauled the heavy meat to the hatch. She then walked to the front window. The tigress was still lying against the door, her eyes half closed, frost accumulating on her whiskers. Agnes took a heavy broom handle and rapped it sharply against the window pane. Thwack, thwack. The tigress's eyes snapped open. She raised her massive head, her ears swiveling. Agnes met her gaze, held it, and then pointed toward the back of the cabin. She walked slowly, making sure the tiger tracked her movement through the windows along the side wall. Agnes reached the refuse hatch. She undid the iron deadbolt. Her hands were shaking. She wasn't just dealing with a wild animal. She was dealing with a starving apex predator whose instincts were currently overridden by the slow, numbing embrace of hypothermia. She shoved the venison haunch into the hatch chute and pushed it through. It fell into the deep snow outside with a heavy thud. Agnes immediately slammed the hatch shut and locked it. She ran back to the side window. The tigress had moved. She was dragging herself through the thigh-deep snow, her movements sluggish, agonizing to watch. She reached the back of the cabin and found the venison. For a moment, she didn't eat. She sniffed the meat, then looked up directly at the window where Agnes stood. It was an impossible look, a mixture of wild suspicion and absolute desperation. Then, she clamped her massive jaws around the frozen meat. She didn't try to drag it away. She lay down right there in the snow, her back against the wooden wall of the cabin, and began to gnaw on the frozen flesh, her powerful jaws cracking the bone. Agnes slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor, her chest heaving. A fragile, terrifying truce had been formed in the deadliest environment on Earth. She had a tiger in her living room, and a tiger guarding her back door. But as the wind howled, shaking the cabin on its foundation, Agnes knew the real test was yet to come. The poachers Arthur had mentioned, the syndicate that drove these magnificent beasts into the frozen wasteland, were not just logging, they were hunting. And the tracker beacon on the mother's ruined collar, a tiny blinking red light Agnes had just noticed flashing beneath the ice on the mother's neck, meant the nightmare was following them right to her doorstep. The blinking red light on the mother tiger's ruined leather collar was not a mere scientific tagging device. It was a death sentence. Agnes pressed her face against the frigid glass, squinting through the swirling ice crystals. It was a modified VHF transmitter, likely retrofitted with a high-frequency GPS ping. Authentic wildlife conservation collars pulsed with a slow, green rhythm. This rapid, aggressive red strobe was proprietary, black market hardware. Agnes backed away from the window, her mind racing. The syndicate Arthur had warned her about was tracking the mother. They weren't just after the timber. The exotic animal trade paid millions for adult tiger pelts and bones, and a live cub was essentially a blank check on the dark market. She looked down at the cub resting by the cast-iron stove. His breathing had deepened into a rhythmic, rumbling purr. He was dreaming, his massive, oversized paws twitching against the wool blankets. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his mere existence had triggered a manhunt across the most inhospitable terrain on the planet. Agnes walked to her late husband's old steel footlocker tucked beneath the floorboards of the pantry. David Whitmore had been a man of science, but he was also a pragmatist who understood the lawlessness of the deep Siberian taiga. She threw back the heavy clasps and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on oiled canvas, was a Soviet-era MT's 255 revolving shotgun, meticulously maintained, alongside a heavy-duty maritime flare gun and a bandolier of specialized 1-2 gauge magnum slugs. I hoped I'd never have to cycle this action again, David. Agnes whispered to the empty room, her breath pluming in the ambient chill of the cabin. She loaded the heavy cylinder of the shotgun, the metallic clack-clack echoing sharply. She then turned to her shortwave radio setup. If the poachers were tracking a GPS signal in a severe blizzard, they would be relying on localized, encrypted radio communications to coordinate their approach, likely using a mobile snowcrawler. Agnes flipped the receiver to scan the VHF bands, dialing through the static. For 10 minutes, there was nothing but the cosmic hiss of the atmosphere. Then, a sharp, digitized squelch broke the silence, followed by a voice speaking in heavily accented English, the lingua franca of international mercenary teams. Signal is static. She hasn't moved in 20 minutes. Coordinates put her right at the old Brits research station. Another voice chimed in, this one colder, lacking any discernible accent. Copy that, Gregor. Maintain speed. The thermal drone froze up 3 miles back. We do this blind. Caleb. Prep the tranquilizer darts for the cub, live ammunition for the mother, and if the old woman interferes, she dies of exposure. Leave no witnesses in this icebox. Agnes's blood ran colder than the air outside. The leader, the one referred to as Caleb, likely Caleb Hayes, a notorious ex-military tracker whose name she had read in confidential wildlife Interpol reports, was ruthless. They were in a reinforced, specialized heavy-tread vehicle, and they were less than a mile away. She had to prepare the battlefield. At 71 degrees Celsius, the cold was the ultimate equalizer. Flesh froze to metal upon contact. Engine blocks cracked if not continuously heated. Exposed lungs hemorrhaged in minutes. If she could strip them of their technological advantage, the environment would do the rest. Agnes moved swiftly. She shut off all the interior lights, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness, illuminated only by the faint, orange glow of the stove and the harsh, silver moonlight bleeding through the frosted windows. She put on her heavy tactical parka, strapped the bandolier across her chest, and holstered the flare gun to her hip. Outside, at the rear of the cabin, the mother tiger had finished consuming the frozen venison. The influx of 30 pounds of raw protein and fat had initiated a violent thermogenic reaction in her body. The shivering had stopped. She was pacing now, a massive, muscular shadow moving with terrifying silence through the thigh-deep snow. The maternal bond, temporarily suppressed by the brink of death, was roaring back to life. She could smell the men approaching. She could sense the heavy vibrations of the crawler's tracks echoing through the frozen bedrock. Agnes cracked the heavy oak front door just a fraction of an inch to listen. The wind howled, but beneath it was a deep, mechanical growl. 2 piercing halogen headlights cut through the whiteout, illuminating the snow like a stadium. A massive, heavily armored tracked vehicle, a modified Vitiaz DT-10, crawled into the clearing in front of her cabin. Its twin exhausts belched thick, black diesel smoke that instantly crystallized in the freezing air. The vehicle ground to a halt 50 yards from the porch. The heavy armored doors swung open. and 3 figures stepped out into the raging blizzard. They were clad in top-tier Arctic survival gear, their faces obscured by heated ballistic masks and thick goggles. They carried suppressed assault rifles, moving with trained, military precision. The leader, Caleb Hayes, stepped forward, holding a heavy megaphone. Agnes Whitmore, his electronically amplified voice boomed over the wind, echoing off the timber walls. "We know you're in there. We know you have the cub. We are tracking the mother's collar, and it leads directly to your back door. Send the cub out, lock your doors, and go back to sleep. You have 60 seconds before we breach." Agnes didn't answer. She stood in the dark, her finger resting gently on the trigger guard of the MTs. 255. She watched as Caleb signaled to his men. The 2 flankers, Gregor and an unnamed heavy-set man, unclipped heavy breaching crowbars and began to wade through the snow toward the porch. They were arrogant. They assumed the mother tiger was dead or incapacitated. They didn't know she had been fed, and they certainly didn't know where she was hiding. As Gregor stepped onto the wooden planks of the porch, raising his crowbar to smash the reinforced window, the shadows beneath the cabin moved. It happening with a speed that defied the freezing temperatures. A 300-pound apex predator does not make a sound when it decides to kill. It simply becomes a blur of orange, black, and lethal kinetic energy. The mother tiger erupted from beneath the elevated floorboards of the porch. She didn't roar. She launched herself directly at Gregor, her massive jaws clamped shut over his heavy Arctic shoulder pad, the sheer force of the impact lifting the 200-pound man entirely off his feet. Gregor didn't even have time to scream before he was dragged backward into the swirling blizzard, his suppressed rifle clattering uselessly against the frozen wood. "Contact! Contact right!" Caleb yelled, spinning toward the commotion, his rifle raised. He fired a 3-round burst into the dark, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the chaotic swirl of snow. The second man panicked. He backed away from the porch, sweeping his rifle wildly, trying to track a ghost in the whiteout. "I can't see her. She's too fast," he screamed over the comms. Inside the cabin, Agnes knew this was her only window. The mother was formidable, but she was still recovering from severe hypothermia. A sustained burst of rifle fire would tear her apart. Agnes needed to break their thermal equilibrium and blind their optics. She kicked the front door open, bracing herself against the violent shockwave of the 71 degrees Celsius wind. She raised the heavy maritime flare gun, aimed not at the men, but directly at the armored windshield of their idling snowcrawler, and pulled the trigger. With a deafening thoom, a magnesium phosphorus charge rocketed across the clearing. It struck the reinforced glass of the crawler and detonated. The explosion was blinding, a localized sun burning at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The intense, instantaneous thermal shock hitting the sub-zero armored glass caused a catastrophic structural failure. The windshield shattered inward with the sound of a bomb going off, filling the cab with burning magnesium and exposing the vehicle's heated interior to the lethal atmosphere outside. "My eyes!" Caleb screamed, tearing his night vision goggles off as the blinding light overwhelmed the sensors, burning his retinas. The sudden explosion of light and heat startled the mother tiger. She dropped Gregor, who lay motionless in the snow, his thick suit torn to ribbons, and vanished back into the tree line, melting into the shadows like smoke. Agnes racked the revolving shotgun and stepped out onto the porch. "Your vehicle is dead, Hayes," Agnes shouted, her voice cutting through the wind like a razor. "Your cabin heater is compromised. At this temperature, the engine block will seize in less than 4 minutes. You are 100 miles from the nearest road, and your optics are fried. Drop your weapons, or you die of exposure before the tiger even comes back for you." Caleb dropped to one knee, rubbing his watering eyes frantically, his assault rifle raised blindly toward the porch. He was shivering violently. The adrenaline dump was wearing off, and the lethal cold was rapidly penetrating the micro-tears in his tactical suit caused by his frantic movements. "Shoot her!" Caleb barked to his remaining man. The heavy-set mercenary raised his weapon, aiming at Agnes's silhouette, but the mother tiger wasn't finished. The explosion had startled her, but the threat to her cub remained. As the mercenary took aim, A massive, heavy paw struck him from behind with the force of a swinging steel beam. The blow snapped his collarbone instantly, sending him sprawling face-first into the snowpack. His weapon discharged into the air. The tigress planted her front paws on the fallen man's back, pinning him to the ground. She looked directly at Caleb, baring her fangs in a silent, terrifying snarl, her breath pluming like steam from a locomotive. Caleb Hayes, a man who had hunted the most dangerous game across 3 continents, finally understood the reality of his situation. He was blind, freezing to death. His men were down, his transport was destroyed, and he was being hunted by an apex predator that had allied itself with an old woman who wielded the Arctic cold like a weapon. His hands, already going numb, lost their grip on his rifle. It fell into the snow. He slowly raised his hands, his teeth chattering so violently he could barely speak. "I yield," Caleb stammered, his body racking with violent, uncontrollable shivers as hypothermia set in. "Please, call a medevac." Agnes kept her shotgun leveled. "There are no medevacs in a whiteout, Caleb. Move into the crawler. Seal the broken window with your thermal blankets. If the engine dies, huddle together. If you step out of that vehicle before the storm breaks, she will kill you." Agnes pointed her barrel at the tigress. The mother tiger seemed to understand the shift in power. She stepped off the groaning mercenary, grabbed the heavy, torn collar around her own neck with her massive teeth, and with a violent jerk, snapped the damaged leather, spitting the blinking red tracker into the snow. She turned her golden eyes toward Agnes one last time. It wasn't a look of gratitude. Wild animals do not feel human gratitude. It was an acknowledgement of a boundary drawn and respected. The tigress gave a low, rumbling chuff, then turned and padded silently to the back of the cabin to wait near the wall, guarding the perimeter while she healed. Agnes retreated inside, bolting the heavy oak door. Her lungs burned, and her hands were stinging with the first signs of frostnip. She collapsed onto her knees beside the stove, shivering uncontrollably. The cub was awake now. He looked up at Agnes, his milky blue eyes wide. He let out a tiny, high-pitched squeak, clumsily crawling over the wool blankets until he bumped his heavy head against Agnes's knee. She smiled, tears freezing on her cheeks. She reached out with trembling hands and stroked the thick, dense fur behind his ears. "Your mother is quite the fighter," Agnes whispered, the adrenaline finally leaving her system. "Just like you." For the next 3 days, the storm raged, trapping everyone in a frozen purgatory. Agnes fed the mother tiger the rest of her meat stores through the hatch, maintaining their fragile alliance. In the ruined crawler, Caleb and his surviving man managed to keep the engine barely turning over, huddled together in agonizing misery, nursing severe frostbite. When the atmospheric pressure finally lifted and the skies cleared on the morning of January 18th, the static on the shortwave broke. It was Arthur. He had coordinated with the Russian military at Tixi. 2 heavily armored Mi-8 transport helicopters were already descending on the clearing. They arrested Caleb Hayes and his surviving crew, dragging them out of the crawler as frozen, broken men. The poachers were facing decades in a Siberian penal colony, a fate perhaps worse than the cold. A specialized wildlife veterinary team sedated the mother and her cub. They were severely malnourished but stable. As they loaded the massive steel transport crates into the belly of the helicopter, Arthur walked over to Agnes, who stood on her porch, wrapped in David's old parka. "You're a madwoman." "Agnes," Arthur said, shaking his head in disbelief as he looked at the sheer size of the mother tiger. "You fought off an armed syndicate and housed a Siberian tiger in the pole of cold. I merely facilitated an introduction between a mother's rage and the Arctic winter." "Arthur," Agnes replied, her eyes fixed on the cub's crate. "The cold did the rest." Agnes Whitmore never left the remote Chersky range. The massive mother and her cub, relocated to a high-security sanctuary in Vladivostok, thrived against all odds, their royal bloodline secured. That freezing night proved that even in the most inhospitable void on the planet, the fiercest fire is not born from a hearth, but from a mother's unyielding will to protect her young. Agnes witnessed a miracle forged in absolute cold.